Welcome to the New Barbarians podcast. I'm Bill Mann.
And I'm Mark Connors. We're here to deliver insights on how current market events impact the traditional investment portfolios of stocks and bonds that Bill and I traded on Wall Street. Today, we see digital assets as the next frontier for finance and investment.
We're also here to explain how cutting-edge tools like AI and disruptive tech are the new barbarians at the TradFi gate.
So instead of Mike Milliken's innovation on debt financing with junk bonds, today's barbarians at the gate are changing the landscape almost daily across regulation, legislation, and finance.
So hit the subscribe button and let's cut through the noise together. Hello, everyone. This is episode 39 of the New Barbarians podcast. Today is Wednesday, October 15th, 2025. Podcast will hit the platforms probably Friday morning. Today, we're joined by Debby Goan, co-founder of Petite Palettes, Harmonic Insights with me, and a former colleague of mine from Two Sigma. Say hello, Debby.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Bill and Mark, for having me.
Debby, pleasure to have you here. Absolutely.
We'll let Mark give a quick recap, and I'll just put in my 2 cents quickly. The markets have been crazy lately. I'm not paying as much attention as usual, but I saw headlines over the weekend that, after market Friday, the market continued to tank. Then I, looked into what happened on Friday, had some words to say about China, and they were negative this time, so the market tanked. And in the previous episode of our podcast on Monday, we saw a rally following some conciliatory rhetoric. And this week things are bouncing back up, but so it's just gyrations up and down, business as usual with the volatile asset markets. And yeah, I guess, Mark, maybe you'll even mention this. There was a crypto flash crash type event on Friday. I saw another headline that I shared with Mark about a potential canary in the coal mine with private credit. I can try and pull up the name of the company, but we had a bankruptcy and then, as usual, a few banks.
Yep, First Brands.
Yeah, First Brands. And
that was a great article. That was a great article. It reminded me of Mercury Finance, auto loans back, decades ago. Auto loans are tough assets. People over-levered, 5-year amortization. Sometimes they push them to 7. And I know that's an auto parts company, but this is not the first time the canary has been related to auto parts or auto.
Yeah. And, the way I look at it, it's either a canary about credit or it's going to drive home some of the disparity in recovery that we often talk about. So if these are subprime types of auto loans that are being factored and the banks are financing, of course, we're going to see more delinquencies and bankruptcies with the bottom decile of our population. The rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poorer. So maybe, with all of the government intervention, they'll just continue to suffer, and we'll all, potentially make more money with crypto and any risk asset.
Bitcoin, Bill. Listen, I'm in Bitcoin freaking park right now. Let's get distinguish. Bill and I always have this discussion. Bitcoin, and then there's crypto.
Yeah.
Gold, Mark. I feel like that's
gold.
Been kind of
Gold.
up.
Nothing's beaten gold in 2025. But back to the slingshot analogy we had with David and Goliath, which as an entrepreneur you're going to bring up, and the stones you're slinging at the monoliths. Gold is like the leader, and then brings up Bitcoin behind it. But go ahead, Bill. I can bring that up later.
No, and there have been some pretty cool charts about the debasement trade and all sorts of stuff. And in the interest of time, I think we'll actually have to gloss over a lot of this in order to make sure we properly talk to Debby. So lastly, what I'll also mention is, I read a lot of blogs, and one of them brought my attention, I think, just back to this MIT report with the headline, 95% of organizations are getting zero return on AI investments. The AI economy is still projected to add 15 trillion to global GDP by 2030. But, if 95% of these investments have no return on investment, that's obviously something to keep an eye on. Yeah, so I'll just let you take it away from there, Mark.
Okay. We're going to be slideless today. We're going to rip the script up and focus on what you just said in the interest of time, but more all the fur flying from tariffs at that macro side to First Brands. Everyone's like, who's First Brands? Oh, why is UBS potentially having a $500 million write down on something that only had $3 million in revenue? Two things. Debby, gold is up almost 60% this year. It's compounding more than NASDAQ over the last 5 years, over the last 7 years. Gold was a better investment than NASDAQ. Put that to the side about why. Maybe because we don't trust governments and because they're going to print their heads off, and you need to have a decentralized, scarce asset. Now let's go to what Bill said about the 95% number. If you're going to try to create value away from a decentralized commodity like digital commodity like Bitcoin or analog commodity like gold that's been a store of value, you have to do it in the most efficient, scalable animal, and that's AI. Every stock, if you look at it, is like a marionette being pulled or pushed higher or lower through the AI force or vector, whether it be the clean energy stock that's up 45% this month, or AMD that's up multiples more than NASDAQ, or the Bitcoin miners that all of a sudden realize they can provide high HPC. So HPC, I'll throw it back to you, Deb and Bill, to tell the crowd what that means. That is now the new oxygen for every company. You need high performance compute. And if you look at it, if I had to distill it, guys, it's Bitcoin and AI. I will hang my hat on that. Will be driving value for the next 5 years. And as you said, 95% of companies aren't there. So I won't even get into, I'm not going to get into it. I'll follow up with a podcast because I want to focus. Our listeners are bifurcated. We have two. We have the sort of under 30 crowd that says, how the hell can I get a job because I just graduated college? And the job I have at the big firm, which Debbie's going to talk about, isn't going anywhere because they can't really adopt AI in the manner it needs to be. So they're looking to switch. And then folks my age that say, shit, I might live to be 100. How am I going to stay in the game and rework myself? When we look at our analytics, that's the barbell audience we have. So when you're going through it, think about that innovation from the big firm, Debbie, you came from and built Two Sigma, why they were successful. Let's just say success is AUM and how much money the partners made. That's one way of looking at success. And where does success lie in the next 10 years for our audience?
So for the avoidance of doubt, success at a hedge fund is defined by return on investments for their investors. The pensions and people who need to retire have more money in their retirement accounts, and that's how we define success. If the founders happen to make money, that's also nice for them. We define success as protecting and growing investments for these retirees.
All right, that's the kind of hedge fund I'd like to be invested in. I'm not sure all of them now. I think the larger ones, I'm going to say, because of the opportunity in the market, have become more asset gatherers, where the opportunity for alpha is diminished. So what they can provide is dampened volatility with a high single-digit return that looks pretty good. So, Bill, if there's an emergent hedge fund that you're working with that can do better than that, go get them. That's why you're doing it, because clients are looking for what used to be the motivation for alternative assets. Well, keep me safe during the storm.
We welcome listeners from all different backgrounds, including large hedge funds that happen to gather a lot of assets because their products are in high demand, and we'll just leave that at that. And since we already brought up AI did provide a bit of some notes for me to bring to Debbie, even though I've known her for 7 or 8 years and met her at Two Sigma. I think it is a funny thing to read because some of this is actually new to me anyway. Or we wanted to talk about Debbie's journey, obviously Two Sigma, and then subsequently she and I started a company called Harmonic Insights, and she's also started a consumer packaged goods company called Petite Pallets, and we'll let her actually bring that up. But, we're going to find out about her journey from Stillwater, Oklahoma, to leading innovation across finance, technology, and the arts. And Debbie was the only minority woman with a member seat at the American Stock Exchange.
Oh my gosh, you're going way back.
And she's been a leader in transformation in fintech and deep artistic engagement. So I kind of love that.
All right, we'll make some corrections to the hallucinations.
Yeah, so please do correct the hallucinations, and feel free to just tell us about your journey.
Well, thank you both for having me. I guess really nice to meet everyone through the screen. I was born in Oklahoma. It's where my parents went to graduate school, and I grew up in Texas because we went all the way back to birth. I ended up going to college in Massachusetts at Amherst College. And it was a big decision because at the time I was pretty set on being a Longhorn, because everyone I knew did that, and it was kind of the path that you did. You did the Plan 2 on-gram, and you did the business school if you got in. And so I even had a deposit on the dorm that I was going to be living in. When I made the last minute decision, Amherst was phenomenal for me. My decision making at the time was if Amherst matched everything that I had gotten from a college perspective. And so I was like, okay, well, if I go, I can always come back, but it's going to be so much harder to go again. So let me make that harder choice now to try and see, and I can always go home. And so it ended up being a fantastic place, in terms of like critical thinking, and I think in terms of skills for tomorrow and skills for today that will just be everlasting for anyone, out there. And I think that's going to be something, just back to what Mark was saying about as you think about jobs and skills for tomorrow, like things are changing so fast that as long as you are really using your brain, thinking critically about how things work, what the implications are, like you're going to be fine eventually, no matter what.
And Debbie, I'll say you'll be better off. And this is
better off.
Offline. We recorded probably the best podcast we've ever had. Sorry, we in the green room, we were just riffing, folks. And the one thing we said about it is learn the skills and just be the best person with the best skills, because we need them now. And you're going to be in a room when someone's going to say something and test your ethics, test your knowledge, and test your courage. And I think by using AI, you can accelerate your knowledge base and understanding systems so that when you're in that room and that moment comes, your centerboard's deep and you stand your ground and you make the right choice for the firm and yourself and do the long run. Now, that's not a moralistic play. It's really what's at risk, and that's the opportunity. So that's one reason why we had Debbie come on, because she's traveled the large to the small and she's seen it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being able to just think critically, like how do I align to my values and my own systems and what I care about to how the organization can be advanced, like that's a hard thing. And a lot of times people want to check a box, and not letting yourself slip into that is really key. After college, I was recruited to go join this trading desk. So I was not the only female minority on the trading floor, but I was probably one of the few, and it was the American Stock Exchange. So I traded ETFs initially, and a lot of the first of their kind, which was really interesting, all through the financial crisis. I remember I was trying to figure out how to hedge the Colombian markets because they just opened up a new ETF, and I was like, what in the world can I do to like hedge my risk here? But, it was such a cool experience, and it was also very challenging to be just very different from, I would say, the typical mold on a stock exchange floor. And I knew that going in. I knew it would be challenging. I knew it would be really different. And I was really excited by the idea of like being challenged in kind of a very, very differentiated way. And when you join, so the Amex doesn't exist anymore, and that's formed downtown, but you sign this book that's like 100+ years old, and you see these beautiful like penmanship from back in the day, and like you get to be a part of really something that's extremely historic, which I thought was just very cool. And getting to see ETFs in the early days was fascinating. Like I'll say that my first day of my job, I think I was pegged by like 3 sugar packets from the equity guys, because they were like, the ETFs were like nerdy and they were dorky and they were not cool and they were like this new thing that was on the floor. And
that sounds like grade school. You always pulled the hair of the girl you liked. Come on. They loved ETFs.
And they're the biggest thing in the world now, and a lot of my former colleagues are really, superstars in that space, but it was very fascinating.
And so what year was that?
2007. Yeah.
Wow.
So bringing it back to innovation, one of the things on the floor that they had like juniors do is you came in every morning at 6 a.m, you're going through these physically printed books to like mark your positions and check your positions for the day. And there's also stuff at the end of the day where you're like, doing your locates, you're like, just basically accounting for your positions as a trader. It was so redundant and so boring. And like during the day, you needed to have certain things like up to speed so you knew if you could trade short and go short during the day, because there's all sorts of like phone calls you're making to get locates and whatnot. And I hated the redundancy. I was like, as exciting as the markets are, it's actually extremely repetitive in sort of the functionality that you were playing every day. So I took the time to automate a lot of that reporting. Not an engineer, just don't like solving the same problem twice. And so I had a great, manager who gave me the space to kind of do that, and we ended up swapping out a lot of how all of the international desk act their short positions throughout the day so that we could be more efficient and more effective in kind of sending out our locate orders and getting the ability to kind of go short throughout the day as we needed. And so that kind of, Mark and Bill, is what sort of turned me on to the idea of like, what is innovation and like how do you solve a problem once versus kind of just doing this routine component. And going from there, I went to a consultancy all about big data, and it was a really interesting space that looked at unstructured data in a way I hadn't been exposed to or thought about at the time. And so this company was called Opera. They actually were founded in, I think, 2004 by an ex-McKinsey partner, and their whole thing was modelers, engineers, business people, which mirrors a lot of quant hedge funds that we see today. And at the time, I think what was really cool and I appreciate was not only the energy of sort of a startup space, but the kinds of problems we were tackling are even today still cutting edge. And, examples of questions I would get would be like, okay, let's meet with this commodities firm, and like, how do we turn soil quality into a signal for a trading desk? Or how do we, and we were looking at things, in the earlier 2000s and 2010s of like, how do you take, we had NLP experts on staff, so how do you
Hold on, back up, NLP.
Natural language processing. So a lot of that is going to be what goes into Gen AI now. And
so, but for our audience, which is 50% conversant, what is NLP?
So it's really like looking at written text or conversational text and turning that into something more structured that you can actually derive signals or actions or some kind of indication to do something with.
Okay.
An example is one of my big projects back in the day for a major bank. They had just done this huge M&A deal. They had thousands and thousands of users. And the idea is that, I'm going to be a little bit vague because I'm not exactly sure. It's over 15 years now, but just in case. It was take their like research analyst reports. So think about, a traditional financial analyst report that would be issued publicly, and take a combination of their internal data and account data for their clients, and take those components, marry them together, and give someone a highly efficient inbox. So how do you make your day more efficient where every potential like email or idea that's relevant to that particular client whose book you're managing or positions you're managing is actually highly targeted? So we were developing this kind of, and I guess it's changed a bit now, but if you think about like Netflix, when they first started getting beyond the mailed DVDs into the online, they had huge competitions around their ranking algorithm. So using that kind of concept, right? So what did Mark watch last week? What did he spend a lot of time on? What does he hover on the screen? Okay, I'm going to recommend these things. So all of those points of data at some point are somewhat unstructured, right? Someone had to map the name of the film, Rocky IV, and they needed to connect the dots from that to the fact that it was an action movie, or that it might also fall under drama, and that Mark's seen 5 of these. And so all of that is the early days of unstructured data and turning that into something that you can then action on by saying, hey, Mark, I think you're going to really like this new Terminator film.
Okay, I have to jump in here. So
yeah, sorry, please go ahead.
We often talk about Terminator, but we didn't finish talking about Rocky IV. Rocky IV, probably 1983, maybe 84. This is the height of the Cold War. It starred, obviously, Sylvester Stallone, and his main opponent was Dolph Lundgren, who was from Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, and he was using steroids, and his steroids actually were the reason why, he beat up Sorry, I didn't sleep enough. He beat up Carl Weathers so badly that he died in the ring. And then Rocky has to come back, train for months and months and months in Siberia, old school, no traditional weights or anything. So he was like lifting up gigantic logs and things like that, and jump roping by the fire in Siberia. Eventually, of course, he does beat communism, just like America under Reagan back then did. So yeah, I guess.
You know, Bill, few people actually credit Rocky Balboa with tearing down that wall, but he did whisper into Reagan's ear, and I think might have given a little motivation to Uncle Ron.
Well, some of it's emblematic, but he did.
Well, I'm not making light of it,
Communism.
Bill.
And then, of course, they were the leader of the communist world, and here we are today. So even
There's
though
a,
that was make believe in some way, I would like to think it was actually real because people like me saw it and were inspired by Rocky Balboa even more than we had been from the previous 3 Rocky movies. Of course, in Rocky 3, he beat up Clubber Lang, otherwise known as Mr. T. And the recently deceased Hulk Hogan also had a very important cameo in Rocky 3. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we gave a quick recap. I think our listeners know Terminator pretty well and the implications in today's world with the advent of AI and artificial general intelligence in particular being something we're all concerned about. Maybe it's like the next threat. Communism is unfortunately still around. Robots trying to take over humanity are certainly still.
that's
I
why
was really curious where this was going.
it's, robots are still around. And Debbie, back to that room when you're going to be tested. If you're not working out with logs on your back and jumping rope in a cold cabin by a fire, you're not really getting prepared because the storm's coming for you.
Not ready.
Sometimes you got to get back to basics.
Get back to basics, my friend.
And I actually love hearing your story because there are tidbits I didn't appreciate earlier. But when you're talking about what advanced applications of natural language processing in the early, it's unfortunate that we didn't kind of get together earlier and become billionaires or trillionaires because that's so far ahead of its time. What I was going to say is I knew a very successful hedge fund that made plenty of money just by counting the positive words in a document, counting the negative words. You do positive minus negative, and then you get a net number. If it's a positive document, you bet that company is going to, their stock will go up. If it's a negative document, you bet that their stock will go down. And that actually provided plenty of alpha for many years. But what you're describing years earlier would have been so much more sophisticated, and I would argue difficult to implement today. So just jumping into that obviously led you to Two Sigma, where you and I met. And I think one thing I would love for you to focus on a bit is the concept of an intrapreneur.
Sure. Well, I'll connect one more dot to today, which is while I was, and I do want to say for a lot of innovation doesn't just happen at the hedge fund. Like a lot of innovation actually happens, I think, on the sell side and also in the smaller SaaS AI shops and teams. Like that's really where I think the cutting edge is because it's not regulated the same way. So for folks in your audience who are exploring different career paths or it's not linear and you can actually be way further ahead in some ways by simply being in the right sort of setup where you're not needing to be as concerned about certain kinds of regulations. Like you can be exploratory, you have the freedom to do that. And that really, obviously you always have to be careful around data rights, but generally speaking, like the bigger ideas really came, I felt sort of so far in the arc of my career from the sell side, which I was surprised by before getting into Two Sigma. And I will say one last thing, which I thought was so funny to me and maybe is very intuitive for other people, but I worked on one project in real estate and we were developing this sort of risk analysis, Monte Carlo kind of model around real estate data. And the real estate data, though, was actually captured by folks on the ground. And there was a company we partnered with, and I remember learning how they get it. Someone goes into a store, takes a picture of the store, and then documents sort of parameters about the store and grades the store. And then you can marry that to local demographic data, you can marry it to crime statistics, you can marry it to all kinds of other things that's already structured. But a key part of like really raw data a person is engaging with. And so anyways, I just thought that was super fascinating and like what a difficult moat to overcome if you don't have that kind of workforce. By the time I got to Two Sigma, someone had reached out to me on the private equity side, and Two Sigma had traditional investments in insurance. I had spent some time with a startup helping build out their New York practice and with their insurance customers. And so got to meet and kind of get into the guts of some of the major insurance carriers in the US out in Connecticut. And so they were looking to say, how do we take talent in engineering, talent in modeling, and create a commercial opportunity that is orthogonal to the core business investment.
Okay, back up. Orthogonal.
So not correlated with like the equity market, right? So how do they create diversification in the overall aspect of the firm? And so I think I was just a weird enough candidate to have built products that had been acquired, but also had a bit of the finance background, but also, you know, like managing, and I was a product manager for some period of time as well, that the unusualness of my background probably lent itself to this role because they weren't really sure, and I think they had sort of been sitting around trying to figure it out for a while. So I joined and worked closely with the senior partner at the time, and, you know, what I liked about the Two Sigma vision was, having worked with insurance, was that you are not going to change insurance unless you can go in at the top, but also have access to the bottom. And I think this goes back to some of the early chat we had, Mark, is that like the incentive structure and the alignment needs to be through the org, really, for transformation and innovation to succeed. 95% of AI projects fail, not surprising. I think it's actually 80 to 90% of all innovation projects, period, fail. And so, you know, it's a catchy headline, but in general, you know, I think it's very hard for organizations to fully get that alignment up and down through the org. And then to create the incentive structures, which don't always have to be monetary. Sometimes it's just visibility. Sometimes, but a lot of times the challenge is that the time horizon for innovation to really take place versus your individual like promotion review cycles don't align. And it's really, really hard, I think, especially as you get deeper into the org, to sustain that kind of transformation necessary, because it is behavior change, and that's really, really hard to do across a bunch of people. And what I've always found is the more subtly you can do it, it's like, oh yeah, we did that, that's done. It's almost like success is not trumpeting success sometimes when it comes to change. So, you know, always question those stats. It's actually not that different at the core. But anyways, back to insurance. We accomplished that goal of building out our own sort of independent spin-out organization within a year and a half of me joining. Like, I was on the ground with our insurance portfolio companies, with, you know, a couple of modelers in tow, and we were just chatting. We figured out proof of concepts. We were engaging sort of across the board, and we identified some areas of innovation. I think one of the things I feel like I learned through that process with the partner at the time was that, and this is really different, you'll appreciate this, Belle, but he was not afraid of throwing ideas out there. I think sometimes you get into certain spaces and niches where the idea of IP can freeze you because you think any idea is IP, and you don't actually know where those lines are drawn, and like everything is special. But he would just spit out ideas in meetings with these senior executives all the time, just to test and get the reaction, just to explore and just to pressure test. And I think one of the things I feel like I've learned is that ideas are really not that precious. You know, like the NLP idea around positives and negatives, or the sentiment tagging, essentially, it's not that special.
That's a totally different mindset than most people. And I was slow to come to that as well, Debbie. And your partner there from the old days, Bill, I think one of his mantras, he may consider just common sense, but I'll call it a mantra, is pursue work that lifts you to your higher better. And the point is, you don't know what your higher better is if you keep holding on to the same idea.
Right. And you're not, it's almost like a form of, I think, avoidance to not share it. And in many ways it can be very specialized, you know, whatever data sets that maybe you have an edge on and someone else doesn't have. But generally speaking, and probably the majority of the time, your idea is already out there by someone else. And so then it becomes about, I think, how you execute that idea. Do you have the resources? Do you have the time frame? Do you have the organizational alignment? And do you have the right kind of energy in the leadership on the ground to carry that through? Because sometimes you can end up with self-sabotage. And a lot of times that comes down, you know, back to incentives, right? And so really thinking through that whole org change, even for small things, is really necessary, because you could be most likely looking at the stats, people are setting themselves up to fail, right?
So I want to go back on this idea of success and failure and innovation, just something you said a few minutes ago about, surprisingly, banks or the sell side has the innovation. Having worked on, as you have, I've worked on both banks and hedge funds for periods of time. And the one major difference that I thought was that at a hedge fund, at a sell side, you're like, oh, I want to go to a hedge fund. That's where you can make money. That's where the intelligent, people are. They can really find alpha, and they're really pushing the edge on a lot of things. And then you go there, and it's stifling at times, because I think the setup would be this: a hedge fund is a room where all of the chairs are faced inward, looking at the CIO, at what they want to do, and they want to iterate off that. And the bank is a room where all the chairs are faced out. Everyone has a fishing pole, and they're trying to bring in business to the center of the firm. And that energy difference, I thought, was absolutely clear, and something that I noticed. I liked the banking environment a lot more from that standpoint about innovation. They let you go and say, what do you want to do? You can try it. You get a little bit of money, get the meeting, get the clients. We can, the quick and dirty spreadsheet was everyone's favorite, to start with an idea and try to sell it. So I don't know if that aligns, or is that in the neighborhood of what you thought created the more innovation at a bank, or were there other different sort of factors that you thought that the sell side was a better innovator?
So I don't know that I've worked with a couple of banks in my career, but I wouldn't say that they had the most interesting ideas, and I think a lot of success came down to the sustainability of that leadership. So regime change can really undermine things that should be multiple year transformations, and obviously there's huge regulatory components to it. And one idea that we talked to a major trading desk, which was super interesting, was the NLP component, and effectively what Bill was sort of describing, but live with voice recordings and conversations. And so the hurdles are like, is that going to spook regulators? Is that the right thing to do? Should we just not do that? But you can imagine, I would say, like a consulting company or a smaller company tackling that on a micro level, just to like proof of concept it. And then you can think about like, well, what does that mean in terms of like monetization? For one of the other banks, the sponsor for that original project, which I believe is continued in the core sort of original like algorithm of how we generated the idea ranking system, that person is now a C-suiter at one of the major banks. So like really, but it was like a 10 plus year, like let's start at the beginning. How do we take the initial data sets? What does that mean? Who are we testing with? How do we get the feedback from the users? And so I think a lot of innovation comes down to people with the right attitudes, who can stomach the longer term vision. There is a lot of, I don't mean this in a dirty way, but a lot of politics and sort of like energy alignment that is required. Sometimes, Bill and I have seen, sometimes it just requires someone making a top-down command, and then people will eventually find their way there. Or not. But there is some kind, I don't know that there's a formula, because cultures are so specific. So I do think organizational values and principles have such an influence that can either impede or accelerate your ability to. And all of these I look at as sort of probabilities. Like, are these factors or components of the personalities in play going to make this happen? And I actually think people are more important than the tech or the process or even the incentive structures.
All right, I'm going to dive on that one, because there's a live and in color example over the last few years that involves ETFs, your background. The popular myth, which may be true, I don't think Robbie Mitchnick at BlackRock has validated it, but Larry Fink was orange-pilled over years. As we know, he was a big pet rock fan like Jamie Dimon in 2017, and he changed his tune because a guy named, I think his name is Robbie Mitchnick, who runs a digital asset, or the DLT group, Digital Ledger Technology Group at BlackRock, orange-pilled him over years. And that's what it takes. I just talked to a friend who's been in the business for 40 years. He said, I just spent 3.5 years really going in. He goes, I now get it. So Mitchnick had access to Fink. There could have been another person who didn't have access, to your point about people. He had access. Fink is commercial and obviously variable, because he changed his opinion publicly. And now they have a $100 billion ETF cranking 25 basis points when everyone else was making 2 or 3 on their broad indexes. And it's not even 2 years old. It's the fastest to 100 billion. So they use that technology that in '07, you were enduring people throwing sugar packets at you, not realizing what was going on because they weren't open or variable. You had it. And now that's a $10 trillion, $12 trillion asset or wrapper for the world's instruments. So I agree with you about the technology's there, but you need the people that are willing to risk, risking saying, Larry, you're wrong. No one wants to hear that. And then Larry risking, change his opinion in public forum.
Yeah.
Those people aren't around. Or I would say this, that's not common, I found.
Not common. It's really, really hard. And I think that's one of the things that, I value, I think, in some of the folks I've had the privilege of working with, which is really like when the data changes, your opinion should be like reassessed and maybe your opinion should change as well. And I think sometimes I forget that not everyone is maybe as like, I would call it practical, but it is hard, right? Because there's human biases going into all of this, right? There's ego going into all of this. And that's why the incentives, when I say all the way up and down, are so important. I mean, I'll get to where Bill and I actually met is after we launched the insurance division, we also launched another small business brokerage called Attune. Super cool. Got to grow this like small team of 5 up to 50 plus. And then I got connected with the head of data engineering, who I really liked, and went to go work with him on some different other projects. And that's really how Bill and I got connected, was over some unstructured, funky data that he had, that he was shipping out, but was not reliably coming back in. And Bill, I'm mentioning this because getting back to Mark's point is when I started just sort of looking at what was going on. So there was like a team that was more junior but very talented, people who obviously went to the top schools in the US. And one of the things I found throughout my career, not just at Two Sigma, but just also, at Opera, and I've worked a couple other places and then also with clients, is sometimes your A-plus workers are not the most efficient people. There becomes a pride of hard work. And ego doesn't always mean like I'm the best, like a macho kind of ego. Sometimes it's like, I worked so hard on this and therefore I deserve. And those people often are often the ones tapped for innovation projects, or like, because they raise their profile in the right way early on in their career, right? They've worked really hard, they say yes, they get it right, and they're diligent. But that kind of path, these are the A-plus students who got almost perfect scores on the SATs, went to the top schools, blah, 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 is often like not a true risk taker and not someone who necessarily is as adaptable. So adaptability is a really key component of where you want to have these kinds of people in your transformation. You want them to have ethics and morals and principles, but they also need to be able to kind of read the room. And it's not just the room, but the dynamics of how is this going to play out over the next 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, like how does this unfold, and have a vision towards that, and not need to be told, what is A+. And I found sometimes when you really dig into like the weeds of innovation, that, and I'll give you a really practical example. One person I think had like a 100-page instruction set to transform one of those data sets, I think that Bill and I overlapped on. And it was such a point of pride. And to be honest, I was like a little bit taken aback, because I was like, oh no, like no one can follow your like 5,000 rules. And I know you took so much time to put this together. I know you worked all night, took all those pictures, made all those labels, like you were so thoughtful, and yet, hard work and smart work aren't the same. And that's a really hard lesson, really, really hard lesson, because a lot of times innovation projects will most likely fail rather than succeed. And to work super hard at something and set those personalities in those positions, that's kind of like a tough situation for an organization. So, there's that saying in engineering, like you give it to a lazy person, right? Or there's the other saying, give it to a mom. But you want someone who's efficient, who's quick, who's going to be practical, because you need little wins to build up your courage and your stamina. Like, even small changes are long changes, because every process is some kind of habit that's formed some way that's calcified in some way. So when you're in that sort of forming stage, you need to steer it in a way that isn't going to be, that doesn't feel like control, because people don't like to be controlled, obviously. And like that feels natural because that's actually directionally what you do want, right? Because that change is better for the org and for this person. But that sort of sunk cost fallacy, I would say, is strong.
Yeah,
It's really
it is. I like your 100-page, how am I going to follow that? Boy, on two things. They did a lot of work. They look smart. In capital markets, that 100-page report and how we dealt with it from a investment standpoint. Every prospectus, when I was at Alex Brown, which was a powerhouse of growth at a reasonable price, spitting out the category killers, Starbucks, all the innovation, biotech back in the 90s, had oodles of deals, and I was on the convert desk. So we get a banker come down when the prospectus came, and if we heard it hit the desk, we knew the deal was going to be a flop because they had to put so many words to sell the deal. And the thinner the prospectus, like Staples, Starbucks, simple ideas, clean, it just was a feather on the desk.
Yep.
And there was nothing to hide. There was nothing. It was an easy message back to your clarion call of the mom practical.
That's clear thinking. That's what that actually shows, is that it's clear thinking, it's precise. It's like that other saying. It's like, if I had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter. And that's really hard. That is critical thinking. And I always also think about it, like when I, manage bigger teams and all that, it was really like, how do you get to like mathematical elegance, right? That's what you want to get. The idea is so clear. And that it's not about my ego, because I'm showing you, Mark, that I've done this work, but not really actually done the deeper work of culling, of being concise. And
that's how you take care of your client. You take care of your client by not waterboarding them with information. Your coworkers. I love that.
Right.
I didn't have the time to write a shorter letter. So muscle through this gargantuan avalanche of words.
Yeah.
Good luck.
You know what, though? It happens all the time. I don't know if you've done this, Mark or Bill, but like, I do think, I overcomplicate things. And I feel like so I started this baby food business called Petite Palettes. And it's been a huge learning lesson of like how a whole industry works differently. And it was a wonderful thing to kind of kick off during it's especially non-competitive, if you will, with a quant fund. But the initial like documents that I put together, the initial business model, way overcomplicated. And I think that is just a thing that we do the first time. I think it's a novice thing. I think there's safety in content, maybe, and maybe there's people in the audience who are really good at just like nailing it right off the bat. But I'm like, now if I go back, I would do it this way, and I could have cut those steps out, and that was a waste of time. And so it's always like my first model is the most absurd, multivariate, like it's just absurd. And so now I'm like, okay, I only need to know these three things, the end. But it takes time to kind of get there. I feel like that's just part of the process, so it's okay if that's where you're starting out as, right? Be complicated. But then like can anyone actually process this? Does anyone understand what I'm saying?
Have good friends that can tell you have bad breath. That's all you got to. You got to have them around. You really do.
You got to listen, though,
But that too, even if they tell you and you're not listening, that's a good. Yeah, see, Debbie, are you trying to tell me something, Debbie?
So before we kicked off today, I thought, oh well, we could definitely talk for like 2 or 3 hours. There's a lot of overlapping experience with us. We've all worked together in the past and are now collaborating on different things. So like a few things I will just throw out there, realizing that we might be running out of time and Mark has another commitment. Debbie, where did you get that coffee mug?
We were just at the Gen AI, I guess I don't know their products, I shouldn't advertise them. But sorry, understory. Gen AI Investment Management Conference at Columbia. And so this was one of the participants.
You got it because you're on stage, you dog. I was watching. I just got knowledge, no cup.
Mark, you have to go to the kiosks and introduce yourself to the people who are there to give away things like coffee mugs. And I have one, and my wife actually likes it because she used to trade spreads at, I don't even know if I feel like bringing this up at this point, but market making firm where the owner ended up being the biggest Ponzi scheme in the history of the world.
Guys, we travel and we pick up stories. That's what we do.
I didn't
and we
mention
share them on
that name,
podcasts.
and that would certainly be another topic. But yeah, I believe that company provides data to smaller, like private equity investors. And so I think they gather and disseminate data for private companies. But we should put that in the show notes since we highlighted them. But the reason I did ask is because the three of us attended this conference, and I think it was interesting and enlightening to see a lot of different applications of generative AI using LLMs and applications in finance. And I think that all of us afterward reflected a bit. I know some of these seem like similar products, like are all of these going to be really successful applications of this technology? I think since it's the startup space, it's not a surprise that only a certain percentage of them will actually succeed. So maybe that's a good segue into what, Debbie, do you think does differentiate like a startup in fintech?
Well, I think I'll speak as someone who attended the conference and then also as a small business owner because it's like slightly different use cases. I think right now, not much in the sort of general investment space. I think a lot of it is really relationships. A lot of it is the moat that you're going to get in like having those relationships, building up, like getting data in the door and having a great catalog. And I think getting in and actually going really deep on use cases. My suspicion, which is probably the least sexy use case, but I think the most practical value prop for a lot of these companies is to go super, super small and tight with your use cases. Like just really precise automations, really precise filtering, really precise labeling, like small. Don't overcomplicate this. And then stack cumulatively those value. I feel like a few years ago, or maybe like a decade ago, I think it was robotic process automation or something like that. And it's just automating processes. That's really where I would use AI for a lot of the stuff in a big corporate setting. Just very practical. Like I heard a lot of how they had like no hallucinations. I just have a hard time believing that any product, to be honest, has no hallucinations. I think what they're leaving out when you say that is like, what if there are errors in the data? And so an example is, and Bill knows, the team that I ended up building at a fund was the first to actually productionize an LLM for trading. And we just took, and it was very unusual. The reason it's special, it's obviously ego. No, but really what was special about it was we were not an all modeling team, right? The cutting edge was perceived to be just the modelers, and we were actually like a hybrid team. And we were really specific in the use case that we chose. We could control the data, we could monitor the outcomes, nothing like no frills, just, like, is this precise? Is this accurate? And can we test it? And a lot of what we had learned through doing human in the loop was really, really applicable to LLMs. And so we were able to quickly overlay our existing, sort of transform the existing processes to incorporate LLM integration. And I think a key part of it was that, I actually ran 2 simultaneous exercises. I split my team. I had half the team exploring external vendors and seeing what they could do, and then one half doing the internal. And I think a big part of why internal was more likely to win was because of the fear. And so I think we're in that kind of fear stage still with AI with a lot of these bigger companies, sort of like the cloud, the early cloud days where there's a lot of fear and like on-prem was still preferred. I think we're kind of in that sort of phase with the bigger institutions. And so if you're going to go internal, be small, precise, think about the scope, have a list of 20 really, really hyper small ones. Because I think the desire is to go big, right? You want to jump on this train. The hype machine is there. And then it's like, well, you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. So
what do we do, Debbie? We go back to basics. We go to the Yukon. Sorry, I keep saying the Yukon. Siberia. We go
just
back to basics, man. Just go back elemental. And I love the atomic win is so easy to do. Not easy. There are more of them to provide. Yeah. That's it. It's not easy. There are more of them. So that's a great.
And it goes back to what we were saying, like being elegant, like a precise solution is actually so much harder because the temptation organizationally, right? No one is on the stage at your like $50 to $60 billion fund excited about automating this like one thing in accounting, right? But that's actually, I think there's a lot of wins on just like the middle and the back office right off the bat. But you have to be really structured and extremely disciplined in how you approach those. And I think we won't have time to talk too much about this, but I think communication skills tied to critical thinking skills is like extremely hard extremely hard. And I have a funny blurb. I guess maybe Bill, you were on this email once, but there was this email where someone emailed 30 people and said they had a problem. And the question was, can anyone help me? And like, it's really urgent. And the very framing of that question was dumb. Who is going to jump in? Like, it's just a sort of like, you have to think about how does the person receive that information so that they are well positioned to act on it. And so I think when you come up with use cases, sometimes you see words like if there's an adverb in there, it's probably not useful. You just, and we don't have the time to go in depth on this, but I used to like develop curriculum basically for my team. And I was like, you can go down the hard path or the easy path, but you're choosing. You're making choices with your word choices, and you're making it harder for this person to understand you and to know when you need a response by and like what the action is. And like an FYI doesn't cut it. And so if you want to be efficient in actually making shit happen, you need to be really, really thoughtful about communication. That was a detour. That was like a pet peeve of mine.
No, and Bill, I know we're going to wrap up. I just want to also tell the crowd, I came into this venture with Bill wanting to just bugle about Bitcoin. Again, I'm at Bitcoin Park. I'm going to Bitcoin Space in Denver tomorrow.
You also turned the conversation back to Bitcoin. We talked about the BlackRock story, and it was very efficient.
Bill's taken me to task again. But the point is what Bill and Debbie's world has done for me, this innovation world, is going to Ihsan Isanian, who then was helping sponsor the Columbia event. Then we go there and we meet people from Alpha Sense, is that right? And then they have a conference. And then I got to meet them, and they need my expertise in digital assets and Bitcoin. And then another conference that I went to in Prague introduced me to a guy who's been working with me for 4 months now, building out this AI generated but human curated, to your point about being simple, calendar. And the pace of change that's happening in tech, I couldn't digest without people being in rooms, digesting, writing, meeting again, seeing how it impacts my process. But that flow of, I would say the forums are there, but they're not always at Morgan Stanley or Goldman these days, folks. The smaller the room, the bigger the ideas and the more value. I think there's an inverse relationship. So I just wanted to say thanks, Bill, for having me on and being that annoying Bitcoin guy in the room. And it's been awesome. And Debbie, having you be the mom with the new food product, bringing your programmatic skills and history from the floor of the Amex to the halls of Two Sigma and beyond has been fun to watch.
Thank you, Mug. Thank you for having me.
Well, that's super nice, and we do want to make sure Debbie gets to plug whatever she needs to plug. But I did also want to, try something kind of new, and you're the right audience for this, or the right discussion for this. So I'm feeling vulnerable, and I wanted to just illustrate some of Debbie's strong skills, and with communication in particular. I wouldn't be where I am without Debbie. During a period of time going on 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago, neither of us were allowed to work. We were both sitting at home with non-compete agreements. And so we literally couldn't work, but we were like, well, what are we going to do? And what do you want to do next? And that's how we started talking and eventually started Harmonic Insights. And then other things opened up, and I'm very happy with all the stuff I did, publishing research on SSR, and like I can't even list all the things that I'm grateful for. But I guess maybe one of the most important ones would be, can you, Debbie, describe for our audiences Bill Mann's strengths and weaknesses?
You're really putting me on the spot here.
Well, usually you just rattle them right off.
I would say, Bill, you're a natural connector, a natural conversationalist. You're really like tuned in, and so much I think of now that kind of ability to engage interpersonally, I think is getting more and more rare and more critical. I think in this age of AI and LLMs and everyone having, with COVID and like being behind screens, like you really see that the ability to kind of communicate, even if it's interpersonally in like a way that's engaging, trusted, is rare. And I think that is absolutely one of your skill sets. I would say that you're clearly very quantitative and willing to try new things. I mean, I would not have predicted that you'd be on a podcast that, We've been super experimental with automating your research, incorporating LLMs, writing a paper about it like that. I bet there's not a lot of people who are actively doing that independently, simply for the sake of learning and to like actually build up entire new businesses off of that skill set. So being curious, I think, is really a key part of the future skill set as well. I think more prominently, I think technical skills are starting to recede a little bit, even though they're absolutely critical indefinitely, but the numbers and the volume of people doing that is going to be less in demand. And the ability to be curious, engage, to be able to have a conversation in a thoughtful way and to like build a relationship, those skills will be increasingly important. Absolutely.
So this is all welcome, but what about the
Oh,
constructive
tennis.
feedback?
Yeah. Oh, and you're also an excellent tennis player, is my
Oh
understanding.
my gosh, now we're like, yes, there's some, that's my second place trophy. That's, but anyway, what about weaknesses?
Weaknesses? Sometimes you start stories that I'm like, where are we going with this one? Where are we going today, Bill? I think overcommitting. Overcommitting. I think your desire to explore everything all at once. That's just not how days work.
And I say no often when people come to me with new things and want to.
Then you turn around and say yes once they convince you.
Yeah, I was kind of kidding. I think I say yes too much to brand new things and new features and expansions and things. And you've been incredibly valuable to me, pointing this out. You know, and we both know it now, so it's even kind of fun when you're like, "Hey, Bill, you're going off the deep end again," and I'm not really sure what you were talking about there when you were up on the stage or something. I'm like, well, um, I didn't have you there to kind of kick me because I was going on some crazy tangent that didn't make sense. So
They make sense eventually.
In the
Just,
moment, that's a great point, Debbie. It's a great point. In the moment,
yeah,
maybe
there's a
not.
journey.
yeah. Well,
You
yeah.
sample larger, Bill.
Sorry.
You sample larger. That's all. And the appetite can be smaller at times. And Bill, it's similar to you and me, and that's why I hired the assistant to work with me, because you and I need more structure in our work. You and I know there's loads coming, but we need to channel it more.
We need to boil everything down to 3 bullets, the highest priority things that we need to clear the deck, and then all of the other bullets either don't get done or they're around for when we actually clear the deck, which will typically be never. So the prioritization is and defining what you're trying to accomplish is so important. So Debbie on a regular basis will bring up a spreadsheet and be like, okay, what are you going to do this date? What are you going to
Oh,
do
it's
this
not
date?
just a spreadsheet. It's we look at the full year,
Yeah. And
laid out by initiatives. Because I think that's actually something that I've seen a lot of even CEOs get wrong a lot is they just don't. There's only so many hours, there's only so many days, there's only so many useful days, and there's only so many resources. So the more that you can kind of, speaking, like earlier on you mentioned my art, like I tend to like to zoom back and just have a full picture view so that we can get to kind of the brass tacks of what is really important and what is actually going to get done, because the temptation is to do all the things. And when you're like deep in the weeds, it's really hard to kind of remember that you had all these other things that also needed to get done. And that's just like normal human stuff. And I would say that smart people also overcomplicate. Back to what we were talking about earlier.
this is absolutely true. And so just to quickly get this in, where can people find out about you, Petite Palettes, Harmonic Insights?
Sure. So I think Petite Palettes, you could just go to petitepalettes.com to learn more, or follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And then for myself.
And sorry, if you're like a new mother, for example, why would you be going to your website?
Yeah, sure. So, Mark, if you need to drop, I know you mentioned
Not at
your
all.
time. Okay. So with Petite Palettes, the whole thing started. I was having a chat with a girlfriend, and it kind of became. She was saying how there's so few like international options for kids, and so then of course I had to go scrape some websites to look at the data, and I looked at product data around purees, and it was like 70% had a sweet fruit or vegetable added to it, and it was 97% lacked any spice. And I looked at like hundreds of pouches. And I was shocked. Like she had it was intuitive what she was saying, because when my child was, really young and we were weaning, we just cooked food for the most part, because you don't see Chinese food for babies. And then it just really became like an interesting sort of market gap that we wanted to explore. So the reason you would choose petite palettes is, one, there's something called the flavor window. So between like 4 months, like 24 months, that's when your child is developing their palate. And the more they taste and try, the more it helps prevent picky eating when they get older. And it's like really, really helpful to like be exposing them away from sweets. And a lot of the sweet component comes down to the fact that breast milk is sweet. And so it seems like the baby accepts it quicker. And so trying new things can be hard. You actually have to have them try like 7 to 9 times before they'll get used to a new flavor. And so we're really targeting that, and also diversification in food. So our first pouches, one was Indian food, so lentils. You don't see lentils a lot for babies. Chickpeas was our second one. So the first one was Indian, a traditional like Indian dal, which is common for a lot of babies in India. And then we had Mediterranean, so almost like a hummus bowl type of meal. And then our third one, which just came out, is Mexican with black beans. So we're really like high on protein. We're between 4 and 5 grams of protein per pouch. We add 0 sugar, so less than 4 grams of sugar. And we targeted high calories, so it's more filling. So I think I looked, when I did the comparison across some of the top pouches and their sort of median stats, it was really shocking. I think like 10 grams of sugar was really common, 60 calories. So like what are they actually eating other than like 5 apples in a pouch? And so Petite Palettes is really about, helping your kid grow to be an adventurous eater, and also have an option for parents that's more filling and more like a meal option when you're on the go or busy. And it's been really an interesting journey to kind of go down something so different, for sure. And then speaking of, I didn't mention this, speaking as a small business owner, leveraging AI in this process, leveraging public resources, fascinating. Like, I feel like the technology available in the consumer side of the world is more sophisticated than in the B2B. Because I think of maybe, and it's more clunky in some ways, but also like far more sophisticated, probably because of the amount of users and the variety of use cases. But it's been fascinating what you can do. The implications for different industries, I feel like are going to be substantive.
And did you recently write something about using Sora, for example, on a blog or anything like that?
I did. I have been writing about my experiences experimenting with Gen AI, not for finance use cases, but more just to explore the tech. And Sora has been fascinating. I think I've gotten a much better sense of like how you target, what is the right shape of a use case applied to Sora as a technology. And so I did write something about it. I forget what I called it. I think it was just like a reflection on it, but feel free to check that out. I've been looking at different kinds of integrations and like different parts of the stack of where I would integrate AI and images. And it is like a moral and ethical debate. I certainly look into the rights of the data. Is it manipulative to use AI in like advertising? How should we think about this? So, those are all like, I think, conversations all small business owners should be having right now. Like, these are real. There's real budget concerns that you have to be thinking about. There's real like content creation in the space that you should be leveraging. Anyways, I'm cognizant of time, but thank you for mentioning it, Bill.
No, and I do appreciate that our audience may not always want to talk about Bitcoin and finance. So
I'm sure baby food, just throw it in there.
yeah, and also your blog hopefully is an interesting tidbit for some other people to check out. So thank you very much. As I said, I don't
Yes.
think I would be where I am today without you, and I hope that you have a wonderful day, as well as you, Mark.
Thanks a lot, Bill.
This was super fun.
Agreed.
Bye.
All. Take care. Hey guys, if you got anything out of that last segment, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, as it really helps us grow the podcast and bring you great content. Thanks for the support.